Apple has got new MacBook Pros, and video editors, 3D modelers, and other creative types are asking, are these finally pro enough for me? And if you're someone who's not a creative pro and just want to get it because it's the hot new MacBook with the new design and the better screen, you should probably ask yourself, am I pro enough for the MacBook Pro? Just in time for the holiday season, Apple has two fairly fancy, fairly expensive new MacBook Pro models. This is the 14-inch MacBook Pro and the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So the 14-inch MacBook Pro, that is a new screen size. It replaces the 13-inch MacBook Pro, whereas the 16, we've had that for a couple of years. That replaced the 15-inch MacBook Pro, and now it sits between that and something Apple used to have and has not had for many years, a 17-inch MacBook Pro, which is frankly a system people still talk about today. They're actually a little bit bigger, a little bit thicker, and a reasonable amount heavier than the previous versions. Now, why did Apple do that? It's because instead of stripping ports and connections and features out of the MacBooks, well, now it sounds like the company has gone back and listened to everyone's complaints over the last several years about what they would like to see, wish lists, things like that, and put a lot of that stuff back in. And it's not something I think anybody ever thought we would see. So instead of just having 2 or 4 USB-C Thunderbolt ports and anything you wanted to do, power, display output, accessories, you had to either get a USB-C plug version or you had to get a dongle or something. Well, now, making a return appearance is the HDMI port, which is something that MacBooks used to have. And then before that, they didn't have, and everybody thought they should. Then they added it, and then eventually they took it away. Well, now they've added it back again. The same thing goes for the SD card slot, which may not be something you and I use every day, but photographers and video shooters use that all the time. It's still a very widely used format. And even the power connection has gone back to greatest hits mode. MagSafe went away when Apple moved to USB-C ports in all of their laptops. So we've just been using regular USB-C cables for a long time, which frankly was always a pretty good idea because there's a universal acceptance of that. If I'm in a coffee shop or an office or something and somebody shouts out, does anybody have a MacBook cable? And somebody says yes, I know 99% of the time they mean a USB-C cable connected to a power brick of some kind. So I can use one that's, let's say, for a Nintendo Switch. I charged up my MacBook from a Nintendo Switch charger the other day, or an HP or a Lenovo or anything, and use my Mac charger in any of those other devices. You can really mix and match. So even though MagSafe is great, and now that I've started using it again, I can't imagine not using it. I did like the idea of everybody having this universal power connection, and we could all swap cables back and forth. That's just a little bit less convenient now. And I don't mean to go on so much about the MagSafe cable. When I talk about my concerns with it, I feel like I'm the only person who feels that way. I've not run into a single other person who thinks that it's an issue or even worth bringing up. I'm just a fan of non-proprietary connections over proprietary connections. But again, yes, the benefits probably outweigh it, especially because I'm very clumsy. So I'm often tripping over the cord, and that could save a few laptops for me. It's interesting that these new MacBook Pros, the 14-inch and the 16-inch, they have a lot of changes both outside and inside. Usually when you get a big laptop upgrade, the inside components change, but the outside is not very different. Or it has a new design on the outside, and inside they just take up the processor one generation. Well, here you have both, but this is a new screen technology. These are mini LED screens, which is the same screen technology that's in the larger iPad Pro and looks fantastic. Very OLED-like look. And they've also shaved down the bezels around the screen, so much so that the webcam is no longer in the top border of the screen. It's actually in a notch that cuts into the screen itself, kind of like on an iPhone. Nobody loves the idea of the notch, but I think on iPhones we've kind of gotten used to it and accepted that it doesn't really get in the way. Here Apple works around that by basically making the system menu that's usually at the top of the screen, unless you've gone full screen on something, making that part of the whole top menu and notch ecosystem. So the menu sits alongside the notch cuts into it, so most of the time it's pretty invisible, and again, it gets you closer to the edges of the screen and looks better. Speaking of which, that webcam, this is something that I think every laptop should have had years ago, but they have not. It's only starting to show up now. It's a 1080 camera, not rocket science, but since we spend so much time doing online meetings and Zoom meetings and Google Hangouts and things like that, you can always tell who has a MacBook because their camera doesn't look good, because it's a 720 camera. I mean, a lot of laptop cameras, frankly, don't look good. The 24-inch M1 iMac from the summer, that has a 1080 camera, and now these guys also have 1080 cameras, and Apple has a lot of signal processing built into the OS that makes it look even better than that. But the difference between using an old MacBook webcam and a new MacBook webcam, it's going to blow you away. You're not going to believe it. This is me talking to you right now from the 1080 webcam built into the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and hopefully you'll think it looks a lot better than the old 720 MacBook Air webcam stuff that you're used to seeing in your Zoom meetings. And this is the view from the 720 camera built into last year's MacBook Air, which is very similar to the webcams Macs have had for several generations now. It's okay, but it ain't great. And listen, it's not good to speak ill of the dead, but I do think we have to pause and mention that the Touch Bar, Apple's little secondary touchscreen strip that's been on MacBook Pros for several years now, is pretty much gone. They're losing the Touch Bar. They're going back to just getting regular function keys. We had function keys. We liked them. They added the Touch Bar. Nobody really liked it. Now we've gone back to the function keys. I'm not going to go as far as to defend the Touch Bar, but there were a couple things I actually liked it for. I liked putting my finger on the fader and riding it for brightness and volume control, and well, I guess that's about it actually, but I like that better than just tapping brightness up and down and volume up and down. The best part about the Touch Bar was always the fingerprint reader, and Apple has broken that out of the rest of the Touch Bar because you can already get just the standalone fingerprint reader on your MacBook Air, on your 24-inch iMac keyboard, and of course here on the new MacBook Pros, separate standalone fingerprint reader, so you're not losing out on the best thing that we got from the Touch Bar in the first place. So that by itself would be, enough reason to call this a huge upgrade or a huge update. Inside, there's even more going on because these are the first machines with Apple's second wave of M-series chips. Apple has moved away from Intel, which has powered their MacBooks since they started calling them MacBooks. So instead of Intel Core i5 and Core i7, now you have the M1, originally in that MacBook Air, and the 13-inch Pro from last year in the Mac Mini, and now the 24-inch iMac. But now you've got two new ones, again, aimed at that Pro audience, the M1 Pro, okay, that makes sense, and then the M1 Max. And if you're keeping track, the M1 Max is on paper the best, then the Pro is in the middle, then the regular M1 is just kind of the regular consumer model. So in our hands-on time with the new MacBook Pros, I tested a 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro chip and a 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Max chip. So I had both screen sizes and both new family tree branches of the M series chip. Now, I'm not a video editor or a 3D modeler, but I do a decent amount of video shooting and editing in Premiere and a lot of CAD work and a lot of design stuff. So I was very excited to test these new MacBook Pros and see how they felt compared to the other Macs that I've been using recently, usually an M1 24-inch iMac or the M1 MacBook Air. Those basically have the same chip. In Premiere, I took some 8K footage that one of my colleagues had shot and just lined up a couple of clips and then added a whole bunch of color correction to them and some transitions and some motion graphics, just kind of vomited a bunch of stuff onto the file and set it to output. It would have taken about 22 minutes to export this minute-long video on an M1 system or on Core i7 MacBook Pro, which you could get up until 2019. On the new systems with the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, took 10 minutes, less than half the time. That's just the very beginning of deep diving into the performance on these, because I've just started looking at them, and we're going to go back and do more battery tests, and we're going to try more intensive workloads. That was just my quick out-of-the-box, first thing I tried with it, and you can see a real difference there, although at this point I don't really have a huge performance difference between the M1 Pro and the M1 Max, but we haven't done enough with them yet to really codify that. I know people have been waiting for a long time now for a really pro-level MacBook Pro because they knew Apple was getting out of the Intel game, so they didn't want to keep investing in that platform. And the first M1 systems from last year just were not powerful enough, especially in the graphics department, to do what they needed them to do. And if you would rely on a machine like this as your mission-critical main machine for your job, for your career, you want to make sure you're really getting the right thing, especially if you're investing several $1,000s into it. So what we come down to in the end is, who are these for? Who should buy them? Who should buy something else? These are very cool looking. They're the new MacBook Pros. A lot of people are going to want to say, oh, it's got, a 14-inch screen now instead of a 13, or it's got a nicer looking screen with a little notch and I get more screen space back, and it's got an HDMI port. I want one just because I want the newest and best MacBook. More power to you. You probably don't need it if you're not doing these high-end creative tasks or something else that is very CPU or GPU intensive. That said, if you hate not having ports and you love having lots of ports, we got something for you. These are also significantly more expensive. The 14-inch starts at $19.99, the 16-inch starts at $24.99, but you can go way up from there, tweaking the exact flavor of M1 chip and adding storage and RAM. And if you want to learn more about the new MacBook Pros, all the links are down in the description below, or you can go to CNET and read my review there. Meanwhile, the humble MacBook Air, still $9.99, still has the first M1 chip, which is basically the same chip that's in that 13-inch MacBook Pro that's still available. That's still my universal choice for most people looking to get a MacBook. That's where you should start. And if you need something more, you could look at one of the Pro models. I'd look at one of these new Pro models. I think the 13-inch Pro as it exists is a dead-end product. But if you're not a Pro user, $9.99 MacBook Air may still be the best bet for you. I also know people who are very excited about this. People in the creative industries who told me they went out and pre-ordered their souped-up versions of the 16-inch MacBook Pro as soon as pre-orders open. And this is something they have been waiting for a very long time.